In Chapter 7 of Detmer, we're talking about the communication skills that are so necessary to successful collaboration and consultation. And there's lots of challenges, even among those of us who sort of, in quotes, speak the same language, our educational language. We can still often be misunderstood. And when we're misunderstood, then of course our goals don't align and we aren't as successful as a group. So miscommunication is a concern. And it can occur through even just semantics, wordplay, the way we say things, the misinterpretation of nonverbals. We know nonverbal communication is more than 70% of the communicative value of what is orally spoken. And also a huge issue is around our perceptions, which immediately alter what we hear to fit it into our past experiences and values. And we're going to talk a bit more about that on the next slide. All of those things can happen outside of ethnic and gender differences that affect communication. So there are layers of things that challenge our really speaking to one another clearly enough that we aren't misunderstood. I like this rendition of the information processing model, and I've noted where I found it, but I put it here just to remind us all of how early on our perceptions affect what we think we hear in the case of communication. So the moment that sensory information comes in, the moment it is, we're cognizant of it, the moment we're aware of it, and it has our attention, our perception has already altered it. So we are hearing what we hear based on our past experiences, our values. It is no longer exactly what it was. It's already our rendition of what it is. So the reason I mention that is I want you to realize how quickly that occurs, how automatically and subconsciously it happens. And so, our misinterpretations are almost instantaneous at times. And that's important to remember when we're trying to be clear that we are being understood and that we're also understanding others and taking from what they're sharing with us exactly what they intend. So again, perception happens very quickly in the process of our recognizing what's being communicated. And because of that, we already have perceptions around groups of people we collaborate with. So very often we have a perception of parents and their role in their children's education and in the collaborative model. It's so critical to acknowledge the role of a parent and recognize that it is a very difficult job and that we may work with the child for several hours a day or just a few hours a day or a few times a week, but the parent is ultimately responsible 24/7, and acknowledge that and recognize that parents are not objective about their children, and expecting them to be is really silly. It's nearly humanly impossible. We've all worked with parents far too hard on their children, and parents whose children have not made their first mistake yet, and everything in between. But to really expect clear objectivity on the part of a parent is unrealistic, I think, for all of us to expect. So keeping that in mind, and then also keeping in mind our perceptions of other teachers or the perceptions of others in the group of teachers as a group, and specialists and administrators, we're all there playing a particular role. We need to acknowledge that the classroom teacher has the needs of many children to meet simultaneously. The specialist brings in a piece of the puzzle. They don't see the child as often. The administrator is playing the role of the school's best interest and what services can be provided. So if we acknowledge all of those roles, we're much more likely to be able to collaborate successfully together. Building communication skills, rapport is so critical. You really get nowhere in teaching children or interacting with other adults in a meaningful way as a group unless we're able to build rapport. And this is just critical. And when I worked as a school psychologist, if I didn't have rapport with the other folks I was working with, there was no way that I could be successful in hoping to be a part of meeting that student's needs. So it's absolutely essential. Responsive listening, something I'm still working on. It's very difficult sometimes to have the patience and the wherewithal to stop and let other people say what they need to say in a group and understand where they're coming from and not dismiss it, and not cut them off and not worry about what time it is, and clearly let everyone express themselves. Paraphrasing for clarity, to be careful how you do that, but it's important. It's too often, I think, condescending to some degree to say, I think I hear you say, for example, or paraphrasing, so directly and so superficially, but really getting to the core of what everyone's bringing into the meeting is the goal of responsive listening, and collaboration as a whole. There's lots and lots of roadblocks to communication, even though we have technology. Technology's become one of the roadblocks. So the nonverbals that are so critical, I think, are really coming to people's attention more and more because of technology. Very often technology removes the nonverbals from the picture, and that's difficult. Eye contact makes a difference. Facial expressions, glances around the room at other people while someone else is talking, those kinds of things can be huge roadblocks to really building rapport and communicating clearly. We also see, and your chapter does a nice job on this, but particularly in their focus on the educational setting, different verbal types of folks who are often collaborating and communicating within a group. And this can be unintentional very often, but it's easy to come across as judging in your statements, being judgmental. Maybe you mean to be under the surface, but maybe not. But the way you express things can sound judgmental, and that's a huge roadblock, obviously. It's also important to recognize that you may have what you believe to be a wonderful solution, but sharing it in a way that isn't preachy. Teachers can often get into sort of a pattern of saying, well, I know this works, and coming across, even though the solution might be perfect, in a way that might be off-putting to other people in the group. And then also being dismissive, not really hearing the concerns of others or wanting to hear them or acknowledging them. But we need to recognize that because they do concern someone in the group who needs to be a collaborative partner, it is dismissive if we don't listen to them. Even if we don't think they're the top priority, we can get through the process of prioritizing after we've actually acknowledged their concerns. And finally, briefly talking about what to do when things get very resistant or negative or even angry. And these look like exactly the same things we do when we're working with students who might have these sorts of emotional responses to us or to their work or in the classroom. So it's the de-escalation model, obviously. And in this case, we're trying to think about these things as we work in groups with other peers. And when someone does become negative or angry or resistant, we know the worst thing to do is push back. However, we are human, and it's easy to feel that urge to do that. And it's sometimes very difficult not to do it. But we know better and need to try very hard not to kind of get into the same negativity. It only takes one really negative person to very often destroy the productivity of an entire group. And it's easier said than done to avoid that kind of pattern. So the better we get at this, the more successful we are if we are working with someone who's feeling these kinds of negative emotions in the process. Again, trying to take nothing personal. We talk about that when we work with our students and their behaviors, and it's the same idea here. It's, again, easier said than done. We're human and we have feelings too, but very often we're not the issue, even though it may appear that it is personal. if we really get to the root of things, we're very often not at the root of it. We're just the target at that moment, perhaps. So if we can kind of separate ourselves from taking things personally, it's much healthier for us and much more productive for the group. If we don't resolve conflicts, then that's when people do get angry. So if we are able to collaborate in a way that everyone is heard and is heard accurately, that we're really getting the point of what they're trying to say, then conflict is less likely, and so we're less likely to have anger occur. And when we see that kind of thing starting to happen, the sooner it can be diffused, the better. And again, this goes back to all of the things we know about working with any individual who might be becoming more and more negative or upset.